All right, so we're going to pick up now with cognitive development. So remember, cognition refers to the mental activities that help us function, including things like problem solving, figuring out how the world works, developing models and concepts, storing and retrieving knowledge, understanding and using language, and using self-talk and inner thoughts. So how do we learn to do all of this stuff? Where does this stuff come from? Well, one of the first people to really study cognitive development in children is a guy named Jean Piaget. Okay, and what he really started to think about is that we don't start out being able to think like adults. And any of you that have ever spent any time around kids know that kids definitely don't think in the same way that we do. So he studied their errors in cognition made by children in order to understand what ways they think differently than adults. Okay, so the error below is the inability to understand scale, relative size. Okay, so for instance, kids will try to slide down a miniature slide, even though obviously it's way too small for them, or they'll try to sit in a miniature car, even though they obviously can't fit. Well, we as adults know that that's impossible, but for a kid, they don't understand that. They don't have that relative size. So they commit these errors. So he used things like this to try to study and understand how we develop cognitively. So one of the first things he came up with is something called schemas. Okay, now an infant's mind works hard to make sense of our experiences in the world. So one of the first things that we use is something called a schema, which is a mental container we build to hold all of our experiences. Schemas can be images, models, or concepts. Okay, so for instance, in this picture, okay, this child has formed a schema called cow, which he uses to think about animals of a certain shape and size. Okay, Daddy reads him a book every night that has cows in it. So this is what he has incorporated, what he has kind of organized his world, that large animals with ears and fur and are cows. So later they're out and they see a moose. Well, a moose roughly resembles a cow. So because the child already has the schema of a cow, he's then going to call the moose a cow. Now, how do we develop? How do we change that? Obviously, we learn as we grow that a cow and a moose are two different things. And this comes through something called assimilation and accommodation. Okay? So many of you probably did this at home. Another example, okay, Daddy reads the little girl a book about dogs all the time, and so she sees a cat. Well, cats and dogs, they're both furry. Maybe if the dog was smaller, they both have ears, they both have a tail, so she begins to call the cat a dog. Well, through experience, through explanation from adults, okay, she is first going to assimilate the experience into her schema by referring to the cat as a dog. Okay, so assimilation is taking new information and putting it into the schema that we already have. Then, okay, through learning, she is going to accommodate, which means that she is going to create her own, she's going to create a new schema that says, nope, dogs and cats are different. So now I'm going to accommodate, create a new schema, okay, and for one for dog and one for cat. So typically the process is, you have the original exposure to something, to some idea, to some, an animal, just say, and you develop the schema. Okay, then new information that roughly matches that schema is going to be assimilated into that schema. But through knowledge, through learning, through exposure, okay, you are then going to accommodate and create another schema for that new thing, okay, and you're going to understand the subtle differences. Okay, so really make sure that you understand that differentiation between schema, assimilation, accommodation, and how that process works. Now, Piaget, through all of his studies, created this chart. Remember, I told you charts are going to be really big in development. This is the first one you really need to make sure you know and understand. Okay, so is his 4 stages of cognitive development. Okay, sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Okay, so what you need to know is you need to know the rough age ranges, you need to know the description of the stages, and you do need to know which developmental phenomena occur in each stage. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these one by one. Okay, so the sensory motor stage, which is birth to age 2. Okay, in the sensory motor stage, children explore by looking, hearing, touching, mouthing, and grasping. Thus, sensory, sensor, motor, moving. Okay, one of the cool cognitive trick that they learn in this stage is something called object permanence. Okay, now object permanence is the reason why kids love Peekaboo. Okay, they realize that even when things don't go away, you cover my eyes and I can't see you, that doesn't mean that you don't exist. When they don't have object permanence, though, they do think you literally disappear. And so it's super cool to them that when you can go like this, right, and all of a sudden you're back. Okay, so, but it's something they learn. They start to learn that even when you disappear, you still exist somewhere. And we'll be watching some videos in class, and I'll show you some really funny demonstrations of this. Okay. Okay. Oops. All right, so can children think abstractly? Okay, this was one of the questions that Piaget asked, and he felt that kids in the sensory motor stage do not think abstractly. However, there is some evidence that kids in this stage can notice violations in physics, things such as gravity. And how do we know this? Because they're typically nonverbal. Well, we notice that they stare longer, they look longer, they get confused, they'll test it out. Okay, now, does that mean that babies are doing physics? Perhaps they're a lot smarter than we get them credit for. Okay. So other things, babies stare longer with surprise when numbers don't make sense. Is this math? Was Piaget wrong? Okay. Are kids a lot more advanced than we thought that they were? Oh, goodness gracious. Sorry. So what, and then, why am I confused? Okay, so in the sensory motor stage, okay, we do realize that, Piaget said that they were a lot more limited than they actually are. And what we're finding out, we are finding out that kids in the sensory motor stage, do have the ability to understand and have a little higher cognitive level than Piaget gave them credit for. And so, even though we're talking about Piaget and it's important for us to understand his classical theories, one of the things I really want to make sure you realize is that this is not steadfast, that we are realizing that, that some of the things that he claimed aren't as accurate as he said that they were. All right, now the next stage, the preoperational stage, okay? In the preoperational stage, they can represent their schema and even some feelings with words and images. Okay, these visual models to represent other places and perform pretend play, and they picture other points of view, replacing egocentrism with theory of mind. Okay, they use intuition, but not logic and abstraction yet. The preoperational stage is kind of the coolest stage. Okay, this is kind of from 2 to 7-ish. Okay, and this is the stage. When kids are just imagination play. The world is their playground. They don't operate on logic. If it sounds cool, if it makes sense, they're gonna do it. Okay, so it really is a fascinating stage for them. Now, one of the things that they get, one of the things that they gain during this is something called egocentrism, or they have is egocentrism. Now, one of the things that, not to get confused with egocentrism, does not mean that they are egotistical. It just means that the world literally revolves around them at this stage, and all of their point of reference is what's happening to them and how does it relate back to them. So in this, what mistake is the boy making? If asked, do you have a brother? Yes, Jim. Does Jim have a brother? No. Okay. Oh, goodness. Now, how does this relate to our definition of egocentrism? Well, because the world revolves around him. So he can understand that, yes, he has a brother, but he can't take on necessarily the point of view of his brother, Jim, to say, does Jim have a brother as well? Now, again, some kids are better at this and some kids aren't. It's an interesting thing, and it'll make more sense, I think, when we see it in action. And I have some really cute videos to show you guys in class about kids in their egocentric frame of mind. Now, beyond egocentrism is something called theory of mind. Okay, so once you kind of move past egocentrism, okay, kids start to develop this theory of mind. And theory of mind refers to the ability to understand that others have their own thoughts and perspectives. Okay, so this basically is other people can think too, and other people don't necessarily think the same way you do. And this is a hard thing for a lot of kids to develop, and it takes a while for them to develop this sometimes. Okay. So with a theory of mind, you can picture that Sally will have the wrong idea about where the ball is because, she didn't, she's not going to think that Anne's going to move the ball. Now, examples of other examples of pre-operational kids. Okay, conservation is another thing that they do, and this is always a fun thing to watch because our minds just have such a hard time wrapping their mind around it. But conservation is this idea that to understand that quantity is conserved even when it's arranged in a different shape. So even though the girl starts seeing two beakers of milk, with this, the same, watches them pour one into the other, and then asks which one has more. Kids that don't have conservation yet will still say this one is more because it's bigger. Okay, or another example, if I asked which row of mice has more, well, you in your adult brain is going to say, well, the same, because you're going to take a minute and you're going to count. A child that in this pre-operational stage is going to say the top one does. Why? Well, because it's bigger. Okay, then we move on to the concrete operational stage. Okay, the concrete operational stage is, 6 to 7 to about 11. They now grasp conservation and other concrete transformations, but they also understand simple mathematical transformations and the reversibility of operations. So for instance, if 3 plus 7 equals 10, they can figure out that 10 minus 7 equals 3. So this is elementary school stuff. Kids at this stage are very logical. They're very concrete. They start to lose that fantasy because if it doesn't make sense, they're not going to believe it. Okay, they're kind of irritating. This is kind of the irritating stage because everything is very hard and fast. They lose a lot of that flexibility that they had in the pre-operational stage. Then we move on to the formal operational stage. This is from 11 on. All of us are in this formal operational stage. Okay, and this is where we can do concrete operations, such as analogies, like my brain is like a computer, okay? We can say, we can have allegorical thing. People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Okay, understanding that this isn't, understanding kind of the hypocrisy of this, not necessarily the literalness of that statement. If you ask this to a pre-operational or a concrete operationals kid, they're going to give you a completely different answer about what that means. Okay. Now, the reassessment of his theory, like we've kind of talked about, we realize now that, kids can do a lot more earlier than Piaget gave them credit for. Okay, and so we do understand, we do believe that development is a continuous process, and they show mental operations earlier than Piaget thought. Okay, and the logic, this adult logic that Piaget kind of believed in is a smaller part than Piaget gave it credit for. Okay, so, even though we do agree with Piaget in certain pieces of it, we're realizing that it's not as, strictly staged as Piaget kind of presented it initially. Now, Leo Vygotsky was a guy who came around and he kind of presented this alternative to Piaget. Okay, and he studied kids too, but he focused on how they learn in the context of social communication. The principles, for instance, of thinking skills, and he saw something called a scaffold, okay, of mentoring, language, and support, continued support from parents and others. So he kind of really talked about this idea that kids develop by learning, by sharing in a much more social context than the individuality that Piaget kind of emphasized. All right, so we're going to end Piaget here. So again, the big things is make sure you know his stages, and we're going to spend a lot of time in class talking about all of these stages. So if you're slightly confused, don't worry, we're going to really spend a lot of time going over a lot of this stuff in class.